So the next panel is on alternative data, and it's going to focus on helping us navigate this space more efficiently. We've got a great group that is going to join us. I think Dan did a fantastic job introducing and setting the stage for this panel. So I'll let Dan take over. All yours, Dan.
So we'll do, I think, Michael, you've already spoke, so I'm going to skip you, Peter as well, in the interest of time. But Lee and Richard, maybe quickly you could give 10, 20 seconds on what you're up to and your background, if that works.
Lee Jorgen, I'm the founder and CEO at Estimize. Previously, before founding the company, ran a stat-arb strategy for about 5 years. Estimize is basically a crowdsourced earnings and economic estimates data set.
My name is Rich Brown. I run the market data team and shared research environment at Schoenfeld. We're a multi-manager platform supporting both fundamental equity and quant strategies.
Great. So I'm fortunate. I know 3 of the 4 of you really well, and I've worked with you both a lot, and I have a new friend today. But let's dive right into it. So pitfalls. Everybody kind of, this is kind of a clandestine marketplace, both for the negatives and the positives. So I'd love to put you all on the spot and talk a little bit about how your organizations, and by the way, we have a very unique panel in that we have sell side, buy side, systematic, different vantage points here, some who straddle both systematic and discretionary from the data sourcing side. Let's jump right in from each of your vantage points, if you don't mind. What are the biggest pitfalls when sourcing data, whether it's for you all as companies and enterprises or clients you're working with, and how have you evolved your process in the last year or so in terms of an audit function and checking your work? Let's start there. Just jump right in, there's no order. First person.
Yeah, I think just looking at from a data sourcing perspective, there's something like 1,500 vendors that are out there in the alternative data space, and you have to avoid chasing the next shiny object. As we're going through, everybody has a good story, or at least if they have good salespeople, they have a good story to tell. What you really have to do is separate the wheat from the chaff and really find out if there's a proven methodology in how they've assembled the database or the data itself and how they're bringing it to market, when the out of sample period truly starts, and just the maturity of their processes internally. If they don't know things like PII and MNPI or out of sample, those things make you a little bit more suspect when you're trying to examine the data sets. I'm
going to stop you there, Richard, because I want to liven it up a little bit. Let's really figure out what's going on. Yeah,
thanks, Dan.
at these firms.
PII is bringing it down here.
You have multiple $1 billion of a family office, internal and external alike. How many people are you using to support your audit function? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it a lawyer? Is it 2 data scientists? What's the composition, loosely, right? And what's the infrastructure needed that you think to do this effectively, both for systematic and fundamental?
Yeah, I think in a multi-manager platform, it's a little more challenging. We certainly have rules and procedures in place that each of the managers have to follow in order to be able to analyze the data. But the data coming in sort of starts with my team, and then we have a matrix environment which includes both legal and compliance in that. So the typical things that people are doing around due diligence questionnaires and really digging into the individual vendors, whether they're the true alternative ones or even just some of the traditional market data vendors that are have a product that's a little bit on the edge of alternative.
And the background of those auditing the data and helping you, is it CS, is it engineering, statistics? What do you find best for that?
Yeah, no, I think in general it's a function of the legal and compliance team. So we don't bring in any data scientists to truly go into the pure audit function. There's certain data sets that we're comfortable with, and the procedures and due diligence that we do are put together that way. And other data sets, I think there's certain limitations to what they're doing now that they don't fit some of our strategies.
Lee, Peter, you all, the 3 of you are really data providers of sorts. But you're all kind of co-founders, C-suite, top 3 executives. You're betting your company, your life, every day on the data that you're providing and how efficacious and accurate it is. Walk us through. I think that's an incredibly stressful proposition. I would lose sleep over about it. How are you protecting your data, your brand? You all are not, with all due respect, you're leaders in your space, but you're not a 1,000-person company. So how do you think about the process and the infrastructure as well?
For us, it starts with how we collect the data itself. So we're naturally a crowdsourced platform where we're asking buy-side, independent, non-professional industry experts to all come to the platform and give us their forward-looking views. And so instead of having that be a complete free-for-all, we obviously use a set of algorithms and a set of manual review after those algorithms to make sure we don't have crazy data, make sure we don't have people attempting to misuse the platform, things like that. So we don't really lose sleep over that because we built those algorithms a long time ago. What we do lose sleep over, or let's say try really hard to affect, is when we hand data over to the buy side to test, it's not just about throwing the data over the wall and hoping that they come back and say, great, we found awesome stuff. That simply doesn't work, no matter how sophisticated the team is. What does work, that we've worked really hard on over the years, is producing both event studies in quantitative research, the basic descriptive work that they can trust, and all the way down to the level of factor models in Python notebooks that we can hand over with the full, code and strategy. That's what I lose sleep over and worry about. How do we make sure that we best present the data to a buy-side firm so it's as easy as possible for them to move it through their process?
Peter?
I would say from our side, we are a data provider, but we are obviously also consuming a lot of data ourselves. So we take in a lot of news feeds, and we obviously are checking the quality of those sources before we let it into the product. So the process that we go through is, first of all, we have to take in the data and normalize the content, turning into a RavenPack XML format, and then we would run an initial classification of the content and then give it to the data science team to do some test on it to see what is the mix of the things that we can extract from the content, how does it interact with what we already have, is the data consistent over time, or is the volume that we're seeing for particular sources moving around a lot, are there holes in the archives, can you trust the timestamps, and all of these type of things. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of quality assurance from that side. Mm-hmm. Then of course in our own delivery of product, we have a great technology and operations team that makes sure that everything is handled as it should, and that our systems are up and running at all times. And we have, I think, is it 99.9993% uptime or something like that. So we are doing really, really well on that side. And then it's just a matter of also tracking what's being produced in real time in terms of volumes across various regions and categories and so on, to see if something is out of the ordinary, and trying to capture it if we see something.
And I'm curious, briefly, when you found errors, when you found mistakes, which bucket does it typically fall in, Peter?
I would say, in terms of things that look a little strange, is that we are not always in control of what we're receiving from our vendors, and especially, if you look at what we would call more premium sources, mm-hmm. there you have good consistency, but mm-hmm. as soon as you go to the web and get content, there starts to be some potential issues. Mm-hmm. You can see, certain sources dropping off or mm-hmm. coming back in, or it's a little less consistent. Mm-hmm. And these are sometimes the issues that we have. Or if we have a vendor suddenly shutting off a particular source for us, mm-hmm. and without telling us, something like that. And we have to go and chase them and try and find other ways of getting the sources back.
Lee, same bucket, different bucket?
We deal with data coming in as well, earnings dates, actual reported results, Wall Street estimates. We have a process to basically do the same thing up front, both algorithms which look for errors in that data, and again, human kind of manual curation after the fact. If we didn't do that, some of our own processes, such as scoring all of the analysts, would not run effectively. The actual reported results of the companies need to match up perfectly to our estimates accounting standards, and the provider of those doesn't always get those exactly right. So before they get into the system, algos will run to catch outliers and things that look like they're obviously wrong. We've had to, be really good at that, or else the end result of our kind of full product, the factor models that we hand over, will not be accurate to what the models say they should be.
Dan,
Michael, go ahead.
One of the things that was really interesting is listening to both Estimize and RavenPack is these are firms who sell data as their core business, right? And so they have professionalized kind of handling of this data. One of the problems is, of the 1,500 firms out there that sell data in the space, many of them are selling exhaust data. They're selling data that isn't a core part of their business. Their business produces output, and they go out and think, oh, this is cool. We'll go and sell this to hedge funds because they'll pay us a lot of money for it. But they actually have not ever professionalized kind of the output, and they're not dealing with the quality of the data. Most of them haven't done testing to know whether their data is predictive or not, but they think that they can just present this data to a hedge fund and the hedge fund's going to pay them a lot of money for it.
That's a great segue, Asher. Maybe we can go to Richard. Will your systematic teams use structured data that's bought rather than unstructured?
It's a combination of structured and unstructured depending on the data sets. And to Michael's point, I think if you start to look at how professional some of these organizations and vendors are, those that are not and they come in and they want their $1 million for the data set, we end up looking at some of those kinds of providers and the trust is just not there. They're changing timestamps or they're recalculating their models. I mean, I was a competitor to RavenPack when I was at Thomson Reuters building sentiment, and in the early days, as new data sets came into the fray and sources dropped in and out, it was very frustrating because you have to go back and then rerun your entire analyses, give them the archive the way it should have been. And for firms that just don't get that and they still want their $1 million, it's incredibly frustrating.
Right. So I'm curious, to that end, is that ever an opportunity set to actually iterate with a vendor who's providing poor data because you feel like if there's game theory, he's providing that poor data to pretty much the world. If you iterate with him or her or that team, maybe at a different rate that you pay, are there some kind of nuggets out there, some golden nuggets because there's something there, it smells right, looks right, and spending the time? How often will you engage in a process like that?
So I think it depends. There's a number of our quant pods that actually engage very readily with the vendors. Not so much that they would pay a different rate or a premium to be able to get that data early. They want to provide the feedback, and there's a learning curve, maybe 6 months or something by the time they have invested in the product and when the vendor comes out and starts to get a little bit of momentum behind the new feature or something else. And it is this tight line between teaching the vendor how to make their data monetizable versus keeping that kind of skill in-house.
I'll say, in 2013, late 2013, WorldQuant was our first customer, and they definitely did a lot of work with us to get the data set to the point, all of these different things that I'm talking about that we've gone through that Rich is talking about. We were not there in 2013. They obviously saw the promise in it. And then once they got us there, made an investment in us later and have continued to do that. So it's incredibly valuable when a firm can take on that process. And the other part is, not to pile on to Thomson Reuters here at all, but when you...
I'm not there anymore.
No, I know, but just generally not to pile on. But, 12 years ago, the academics went and got a cut of the Thomson Reuters IBIS data, a 10-year cut. They went back 10 years later, asked for the same cut, and 20% of the estimates had been added, removed, or changed. And this is the crown jewel data set of my industry, and yet it was that dirty without point in time kind of data. So it's a problem across the board.
I wanted to add as well, in terms of the interaction between the manager, the hedge funds and asset managers and the vendors. I think the level of engagement that they're willing to make also depends on what the type of data it is and how mature that data vertical is. We could definitely see that there were a lot of funds that were willing to kind of provide feedback early days for us. But I think if there's another news analytics provider jumping into the space, probably the funds are not as willing to help because there are good quality alternatives out there. But of course, if you come out with a completely new and unique data set that people find exciting, then but it's not really up to scratch yet. Then I think they are willing to make that investment because at the end of the day they're looking at if it could help them make P&L.
You're cueing me again, Peter. So thank you in advance. That's a great point. I think what that's an allusion to is what are you all seeing in the space, and each of you have experienced this in terms of the convergence between discretionary, systematic, some crowding of strategies, degradation of performance. how willing are systematic investors, you all, namely, and feel free to raise your hand and jump right in as well, but how often now, because we've seen it, are systematic investors starting to change the parameters, the draconian parameters that they've had historically for data, for innovation, and for the opportunity of alpha creation? We've seen a little bit of that firsthand. I'm curious what you all have seen.
Well,
Michael?
Clearly, we've done a lot of searches for systematic investors to help them find unique data sets. And one of the most obvious ones is kind of the amount of history, right? It was always the case that we always had to find data sets with 10 years of history or what have you. And clearly, most of the systematic investors who are looking at alternative data will say, okay, if I can get 3 years, 4 years would be great, but if I can get 3 years of history, that would be spectacular. And even that's difficult. So they're looking at other things, periodicity, all those other things to see if there is a data set that they might want to try that they wouldn't have in the traditional sense.
Well, let's, it's interesting. Let's be clear. I think two things I think we'd agree with, and I'd love your feedback, is one, we've definitely seen systematic funds moving down the food chain, if you will, of parameters for duration and frequency. Whether it's 3 years to 2 years, are we going to be at a year from now? Who knows? That's obviously a function of the consolidation of the systematic space and crowding. And two is, we've seen some traditional price volume systematic asset managers start to actually delve now for the first time and dip their toe in to the alternative data strategy. There's 3 or 4 massive ones that we all know that have searches going on right now. Any perspective on either of those two subject matters?
Yeah, I think from a depth of history kind of perspective, I mean, we're definitely seeing some of our managers take a shorter duration. But what we also want to do, from my perspective in the sourcing, is give them alternatives to that particular data source. So if you're looking at credit card information or so, and we're starting to get some decent history there, you might complement it with geolocation data to see, does it make sense that that there is a rise in number of people in the store and obviously the number of credit card swipes. So things like that, when you can get a little bit more confidence because 2 or 3 data sets agree with each other, I think that's it's a good approach to shrinking the acceptable time period for the history.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That it's, I think one of the reasons for why they're accepting shorter time periods is that they have other data sets to benchmark it up against to kind of validate that it makes sense. I would say we are not really getting a lot of pushback on history because we have very long archives. But I remember early days, a lot of what we heard, it was like 5 years was the minimum if you go 5-6 years back. But I think it also depends on who you are selling into, right? So if you're selling into someone that have fairly short investment horizons, then they can accept a shorter history. But if you go to more fundamental shop that is looking 6, 12, or even more months out into the future, they need a longer data set in order to capture ideally several cycles. Right?
It's totally spot on, as they say here in London. So, one other thing that we've seen actually is the paradigm that used to exist on the discretionary managers, which was long short, core ideas on the long short side, and then trading around smaller positions on lower confidence interval. That would be the analogy that I would use to what's going on in the systematic community. Still being draconian, often in parameters with 80 or 90% of the book, but lowering that threshold for smaller basis points positions that they're less kind of confident on. So, Richard, you give me a nice segue. Why don't we change it up real quick? Because I like the whole lightning theme and to keep people awake. Types of data, what's great, what's not so great right now? Everyone's using credit card panels. Is the decay now kind of put everyone else on a playing field? There's very few credit card panels coming into the marketplace. Should we care about credit card panels anymore? And what's a new vertical that you think is topical, timely, that you actually think is efficacious, that you're spending a lot of time on?
Yeah, I think credit card panels, I mean, there's 600 or so people on the Yodlee data set, for example. I think, as you start to look at other panels, can you get a different, swath of the country or so? There's a couple out there now that are hitting the middle of the United States and using that. There's one in here for London or for the UK. So seeing if those things are different enough or different enough from a timing perspective on when you can get that, because some of these data sets are delayed if you're not paying for the, the full boat for the premium. So I think the opportunities, though, are elsewhere, and if we look at sort of my passion, and obviously the folks here at RavenPack, unstructured data is key, and the more you can extract from not just news or social media, but there's other textual data sources. Use your imagination. I'm not going to give you the blueprint, but those things can start to be very interesting when you compare them against other factors. So in if we look at estimized data, how that plays with IBIS data is a pretty interesting sort of way to look at whether or not Lee's signal can actually give you something different than what people are already getting from the IBIS data. So if you're jumping in front of somebody else with that particular signal, then you're beating a factor that's already well established in the marketplace.
Richard, let's make it a visceral dialogue here. What's the category of data that you would prescribe to this audience not to use, or to use least, or to give you some indemnity that you're most suspect and circumspect on?
I think geolocation is a problem.
We can make a 3-word response. It's okay. I think it speaks for geolocation.
Yeah, there's certain aspects around the use of the data and how well you can triangulate to really keep the person anonymous. There's various techniques in the data science space that I don't care that it's you, but I can probably tell which one is you if I wanted to. That generally gets our compliance folks a little bit more nervous.
Yep.
That being said, hey, rush right into it. Go chase those things so I can take your money elsewhere.
Michael, care to take a swag at that one?
Yeah.
Least, most circumspect, least likely category. These people should just save their time, move past it, tell their managers or themselves, let me just move on. This is really not a great use of our time.
Most of my clients have tried and haven't been able to get consistent signal from social media sentiment.
There we go. All right.
So
social media. Care to retort, Peter?
I can definitely
often throw you all in that bucket.
No, well, we don't necessarily focus on something like Twitter, which is what you have been looking at probably, because it's an extremely noisy data source. But one of the things that I think has been interesting, having been part of the industry for more than 10 years and listening to what alternative data sets people are interested in, I think you can kind of see that there are certain data sets that are popping in and it's getting all the attention, and then it completely dies down and no one ends up using it really. And having seen that, of course, news analytics, looking at news and blogs and so on, were probably one of the first data sets that you would consider alternative, like that moves beyond more structured content, right? And then, you started seeing Twitter becoming really hot, and everybody were talking about Twitter.
The Twitter fund.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that kind of blew up here in London, in fact. And then it died down. Everybody were trying to go after Twitter sentiment. No one was really finding much. Some were finding a little bit and saw value in consuming from multiple providers, but it never really was anything that crazy good. So it kind of just died down. Then it got a second life when Trump became president, and everybody were talking about Trump tweets. That also died down pretty quickly.
Yes.
So Twitter is kind of coming and going, and there might be a third life for Twitter, I think, when we start to be able to extract more in terms of consumer sentiment and so on. The technology is just not there yet.
Twitter recently shut down their public API, no?
I think they have kind of changed the model a little bit.
But changed the model, so let's modify that.
But there are companies that have access to full fire hose and so on, but not necessarily performing particularly well in the financial space. But you have also seen other types of data sets popping in and out. Credit card, of course, was very hot, and probably it's been consumed so much now that it's no one really talks about it as much as that much anymore.
Only the price tag we still talk about.
Yeah. So let's switch gears.
But satellite imagery, sorry, that was the last thing I wanted to mention. Satellite imagery has been one of the data sets that have been really hot recently, and that seems to have died down a little bit as well now.
It does, and it seems like as a function of that, they're pivoting into new verticals, right? It seemed like everyone was counting cars, then they were counting drawdowns of energy, and now we're moving on to agricultural estimates. So it's interesting. There seems to be a saturation level, and then evolution to other verticals. I want to switch to Lee. Lee, you're one of the more out-of-the-box thinkers I've worked with. Let's take the opposite of this question. Look around the corner what people don't see. What do you see out there that's really exciting you, that's changing? And these are not rehearsed, so I'm not catching you off guard, but hopefully that's what we do for the audience here, make it a little bit catalytic. What are you seeing around the corner? Maybe you haven't tested it yet, you don't know if it's right, but it's exciting and interesting to you, and everyone else here should kind of take a look at it and spend some time.
So I'm going to say one thing and then get.
And then they can get back to Meet Drogan at estimize.com and let them know what they think of that.
No, so I 100% agree with Rich that geolocation data is the thing that you should not look at today, and that it is 100% the thing that you should look at in like 2 years, because it will be the holy grail of basically everything. The problem is, as Rich kind of alluded to, is there is no point in time nature of the actual location. You have all the people, you have the point in time nature of all the people historically, but like one day down the street it's a KFC and the next day it's a Taco Bell, and there is no data set that tells you what it was at what point, and in order to understand kind of the correlation to some kind of revenue or foot traffic, you need that whole data set, and I have not yet seen a full kind of data set of that. But once they have this, and God knows people are working on it right now, that data set is going to be miraculous. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing that kind of pretends more to us is as the ability to crowdsource more data from the web and people on the web as they interact more with each other in structured data sets comes to pass. I look at one specific thing in the kind of long-short or discretionary world as being really important. I think that 80% of an analyst's job is basically wasted on writing up a PDF research report. And one of the things that I think is going to happen is instead of shoving a PDF in an RMS, a unstructured RMS system, these analysts are going to be structuring these kind of unstructured variables. How good was the earnings call? Do I trust the CFO? All of these little things that an analyst does so that they can basically hand this data over to their quant team and they can understand kind of the unstructured variables of the analyst. I think that somebody, maybe us, maybe somebody else, we'll see, gets to basically crowdsourcing that unstructured data from the analysts and then being able to have an understanding of how good does the market believe the CFO is, or how trustworthy was the conference call. I think we're going to end up getting into all of that as a market eventually, and I think it'll be a really good thing.
Yeah, if you can get that data structured directly from the analyst, then you can save the RavenPack team a whole bunch of time shredding the text that just gives you structure.
I mean, I'm sure huge Fidelity and Wellington, they're all trying to run semantic analysis on all of their unstructured RMS system PDFs, and God knows we can circumvent that by having the analyst structure their data.
It's great.
It's good that it's not only analysts that provide good information.
All of the people, yeah.
So let's switch gears, because where we're sitting today in the lovely city of London, where is Europe right now in the data community? Are they a laggard? Are they a leader? How do we think about them in the context both of supply and demand relative to the US and Asia? And this will be our last question for me, because I'm getting the signal from our friend in the front here that we've got to go to questions and ultimately cocktails and scotch, which I hear you're not adverse to. View of the regions?
London seems to be significantly advanced in the systematic space. On the discretionary side, it's way behind, probably still dealing with long only. We've seen some good, in Paris, some good systematic shops. Zurich, Geneva, some good systematic shops. But I think the rest of Europe on the discretionary side is pretty far behind.
Anyone disagree?
I would say, US for us has been, 5 years ahead of the rest of the market, but we are seeing Europe catching up really, really fast. Again, London and Paris with strong centers.
Besides becoming a RavenPack subscriber, what would you prescribe to the European community, to the London community, to kind of be out in front of that, given that game theory where they're lagging? Any views on what they should be focused on here and now that's actionable that would help them?
Well, I'm definitely biased. I tend to spend most of my time with RavenPack content, right? But I would say, data sets that, it's good to find data sets that kind of work well together. Some of the data sets that work well with our data is if you start looking at something like short interest and these type of things.
Yep.
That's quite valuable information. So if you get hold of something like that and start to use that.
Market structure is interesting, particularly among the schisms within EU, right, in terms of what they're allowed to disclose. I think I'm supposed to ask for questions. Any questions in the audience before we move on to cocktails? Prefer one? No one brave? Okay. I guess cocktails it is. Thank you, everyone, for being part of the panel.
This is RavenPack.